Alrighty, so the Green Revolution basically was the technologicalization, I don't know if that's a word or not, probably not, of agriculture, basically. And like I said, this is the most important thing. This is how people get fed, so certainly this will be the best way to apply technology more so than having a little computer in your hand that occupies your time 24/7. Much of this came, well, pretty much all of it came and is still going on in the 20th century, much of it post-World War II, although it started many of the techniques, etc., and the process, particularly like the development of chemical fertilizer and things like that, started before World War II, and then people got into the business of war, and then it, interestingly enough, death begat life, and that a lot of the technology that they used in the war actually was devoted more towards machines and things like that. But development of petroleum products, etc., also helped. Discovered oil in the Middle East. A whole bunch of things came together, and this really, the whole process really peaked in the 1960s. In particular in Mexico, and then later in Southeast Asia, etc., where there was a very extensive process involved, not only in the development of the technologies, but pushing it, getting it into these developing nations and things like that. Areas where they had enough of a labor force, etc., that they could put it in place without a huge amount of money and start into a very large-scale production of more and more food, which of course is a good thing in that respect. So the four main things that you got from there was your genetically engineered crops. That was a big one. Certain types of wheat and rice were developed that can grow faster, and therefore in many cases produce double the amount of grain that their things that were used before could. Irrigation, the expansion of irrigation, a lot of places before had what they call dry ground crops, where you would get limited yield, but you didn't have to irrigate. They used canals and plumbing and all kinds of other things to get water to places that didn't have water before, and therefore that way expand the amount of things that were grown. Chemical fertilizer is a big one. Chemical fertilizer, the thing about it is that we've talked about the fact that plants generally need decomposers, bacteria and funguses, to break down organic waste into inorganic waste, and the plants can then absorb that inorganic things like phosphates, nitrates, calcium, iron, that kind of stuff. But the chemical fertilizers bypass that process. So plants can absorb these different compounds directly and therefore grow much faster. But as we'll see, this has led to a lot of other problems, however. And then, of course, pesticides. And one of the things that you see also, a relationship here, at the forefront of all this, like I said, is these genetically engineered crops. But because of the fact that these crops do grow so fast and produce so much of the produce of the grain and everything that the people want, that we eat, they need more water and they need more fertilizer than the normal soil and normal environmental conditions would give it. And so consequently a lot of that was used. And then the other thing is that the plants tend to lose out on certain natural resistance characteristics, such as resistance to pesticides. It makes them weaker in a lot of other ways. Although they're working on that, where you get these kind of super crops that are both drought and pest resistant as well as a high output. But at the beginning it was a trade-off. And so consequently, to balance that, more pesticide usage. And that's one of the things also with pesticides, is that most of them are all made from petroleum products, and petroleum became a lot more available in the 1950s. Prior to the 1950s, much of the world's petroleum supply was actually the United States, but that was already starting to run out. Where do you think they discovered oil in the 1950s? It made a huge difference in many areas, where most of the oil is now, petroleum. Middle East, right? Saudi Arabia, the Middle East, that's where they're like, hey, look what's here. And all the Middle Eastern countries prior to that were poor, extremely poor. That changed things a lot for them, and it changed really the way we operate around the world. So there's a lot of stuff you see happen both post-World War II and the 1950s discovered oil in the Middle East, so that changed a lot of things. The the positive side, and I can't downplay this enough. It's been estimated that up to, or over, I should say, 1 billion lives have been saved because of this. People that got food that didn't get food before. And you have to come to the realization that in many parts of the world, death from malnutrition is still very common. Okay, so that doesn't really happen in the United States. Not in other developed nations. Not in situations where people know about it or whatever. Unless it's forced upon somebody. But in general, just because people are not dying for lack of food, but that still happens in much of the developing world. This has put a major dent in that whole problem. Billion lives. However, as we shall see much throughout the rest of the course with a lot of these things, particularly look at pollution, environmental impacts came from that as well. So that's the negative side of the whole process. So, all right, so we can compare the before and after kind of what agriculture was like before and still is in some areas, and what it's like now. This also it relates you back to when we talked about demographic transition. With traditional farming, you're going to see these in your pre-industrial and your early phase transitional societies. They do transition through that into industrial type farming and that kind of thing as the society changes and goes through the demographic transition. So keep that in mind. So productivity on a traditional farm in comparison is fairly low. Although I will say this, traditional farms, much more of it gets consumed. Another trade-off we have with industrial farming is because the fact that a lot of times it's going to end up being eaten somewhere much further off. You have a lot of spoilage and a lot of waste in it. However, it's still just the high output of the farm itself still balances that out to the plus, so that you get more food from an industrial farm overall. More people will be fed from it. The labor on a traditional farm is going to be high. That's because of a lack of equipment. On the industrial side, it's lower. And so if you've ever seen these big combines that they're like the size of, maybe exaggerating, but about half the size of the courtyard, they're huge vehicles. They're 4 or 5, that's not an exaggeration, they're 4 or 5 stories tall in many cases, that harvest acres at a time. And that takes the work of 20 or more people, just one person operating it. They cost usually close to $1 million, but that works out, of course, and they're efficient, etc. What that also means, though, is we'll see one of the as you might imagine, one of the main impacts on the environment is the use and burning, etc., of fossil fuels. A big part of that is agriculture. Once again, we don't think about it. We think about cars and trucks on the highway, etc. But a lot of it is farm equipment and everything, of course, is also burning fossil fuels when it does that. Use of organic fertilizer in a traditional and industrial, they call it chemical. Now, to be exact, it would be inorganic, but I'm going to go with chemical because that's the most commonly kind of generic name used. They're both technically chemicals. These are inorganic chemicals: phosphorus, nitrogen, potassium. That's your big 3. If you ever see like 3 numbers on a fertilizer label, that's the amount of each one of those. I don't know if that's the right order or not, but like you see 666 fertilizer, it doesn't mean it's Satan ground up and stuff you put on your vegetables. It means that there's 6% nitrogen, 6% phosphorus, and 6% potassium from there. All right, pest control, we're going to call this integrated pest management. We'll learn what that big, long, fancy term means in a minute. And then over here on the industrial side, it tends to be pesticides. And crop variety with a traditional agriculture, just think of it, you want to grow things. One of the main reasons you have it is to grow food for your family. So you're going to grow a variety of things. Whereas with industrial agriculture, monocultures are common, growing all the same thing because that's more efficient. You also got a lot of times at the facility, the processing things, they sometimes take it straight to where it's going to be packaged to be shipped out as food, and that's always going to be easier when you have one particular crop. This is mono, by the way. And then finally, the soil depletion. The soil depletion in traditional agriculture is low, and it tends to be high in industrial agriculture. The value of soil has been known since people started growing crops, so 10, 15,000 years. And so consequently, people have developed the current soil conservation tactics that we have now. Much of them are thousands of years old. People have known about them for a long time. Different types of crops, contour plowing, all the other stuff we talked about before. Crop rotation that mentions in the Bible to not necessarily rotate your crops, but to let your field, what they call lay fallow for a year, which means don't plant anything on it. That rejuvenates, and that's a common soil conservation process. So people know about that for a long time. Industrial, they kind of said, you know what, we know that this is not good for the soil, but we're getting much more output, therefore we'll just keep what they do is they prop up that soil by continually adding chemical fertilizer to it. So that even the soil itself actually ends up being poor after a while because it takes so much out of it from the produce from it, but they just put the chemical fertilizer down and don't worry about it. Questions? Anybody?
Yeah.
Yes.
Crop variety for the first one.
Yeah.
Talk about that again.
Polyculture. So poly means many, right? So if you're going to have a traditional farm, like I said, just kind of think of feeding your family. You want to grow, maybe some root vegetables and some fruit, and et cetera, et cetera. So you're going to have a variety of crops. As we learned in soil conservation, that's better for the soil because you don't have one thing taking all of a certain type out. Whereas in a traditional in an industrial big farm, you can have a big thing, acres and acres of wheat or whatever it is that you're growing. It tends to be only one thing because that's more efficient to do on an industrial scale. That makes sense? Thanks for asking. Anybody else? Any questions? All right, we actually have another slide in this presentation, so